I got most of my dock out. I've been kind of lazy. I took it half out. I'm on part of it right here. And I got part of it right there. Um, but yeah, I got my other tiny little dock right there. That was here when we bought the house, and then I built this one myself. Um, but all right, guys. It's a nice day. It's actually not that cold. There's some swans out there, some geese. Um, nice calm day. But here is an assignment that we would have done had there not been some COVID-related issues making it so I couldn't assign this this final week of school here. But I kind of just wanted to talk about it so you still kind of get the benefit of learning. Even though I can't assign it, you can still kind of learn here. We would have done this assignment where you wrote a diary and made 4 entries, and you put yourself in the shoes of an African American living back then in a time period that we've been talking about, like the antebellum period right before the Civil War, Reconstruction, and then post-Reconstruction time period. Yeah, I didn't intend to print it out the way it came out with the black everywhere. I know it's a waste of ink. I don't know why the printer did that. I didn't intend for that to happen. It should be inverted with black typeface, letters, and then the white background. Is how I thought it would come out, but for some reason it came out this way. But and the one thing I kind of hope that you can kind of understand by kind of talking through this is that some things change for African Americans during this time period, and some things kind of stay the same. And we'll kind of talk a bit about this. In the antebellum period, keep in mind this. 10.7% of African Americans living in the 1860 census time period were free. 10.7%. So if you kind of do the math, you're looking at 89.3% of the African American population being slaves. So the vast majority of the black population in the 1860 census are slaves. Of the free black population, a slight majority live in the South, but a very large minority live in the northern free states. And so if you're a black person living in antebellum America, the odds are you're going to be a slave. Moreover, that we don't know for sure because the statistics aren't really there. The government didn't take great statistics in this regard. But the fact of the matter is the vast majority of black people before the Civil War were illiterate. I've seen estimates where only 10% can read and write. Some estimates estimate a little bit higher at 20%. But the fact of the matter is the vast majority of slaves couldn't read or write. And keep in mind, many areas had laws prohibiting slaves to be taught how to read or write because of the fact that they were worried that, well, you have literate people like Nat Turner who created rebellions, and education gives you power and knowledge, and education can help you. And if you can read and write, you can send correspondence and hide correspondence for other slaves to plan an uprising. So the fact of the matter is they didn't want slaves educated. And it's not like most states, some even in the North, but especially in the South, most states wouldn't want to set up schools for free black children anyways. So the fact of the matter is the vast majority of slaves couldn't read or write. The vast majority of free blacks couldn't read or write. And that's because of the discrimination in the system at the time. And in you all students today probably wouldn't be able to read or write either if it were illegal for you to be taught to read or write. So kind of keep that in mind too. And so you kind of look at what's going on in the Antebellum South Era here. So the odds are you'd be a slave. The odds are you wouldn't be literate. And you look at some of these major events, like the Dred Scott, the famous Supreme Court decision in 1857, where the Supreme Court ruled that, first of all, Dred Scott, as a black man, wasn't a citizen and couldn't have legal standing in the court. but also essentially ruled that he was still a slave, always a slave, that Congress has no right to prohibit slavery from the territories. The territories are a common territory for all, and it's discrimination against white Southerners to say they can't bring their property out west to the territories. And this 1870, a lot of people say this is one of the worst, if not the worst, Supreme Court ruling of all time, because there's already severe tension between the North and South, and then this ruling just throws gas on that fire, because people start to wonder, is this can northern states truly be free if slave owners can travel through, and the Dred Scott, a slave, is still a slave while living in Illinois, and then later the Wisconsin area up in like modern day Minneapolis area. And so a lot of people start to kind of wonder that about that. And so this ruling here says that black people aren't citizens, can't be citizens. John Brown's raid, this white abolitionist who takes over a federal armory down in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, today West Virginia. But that was 1859. Tears the country apart. October 1859 is when he's caught. The trial's November. He gets executed December. Lincoln's election. The Republican Party is primarily Northern Whigs. Some Northern Democrats defect over, some Free Soiler. There's a third party for a while called the Free Soil Party, kind of come into the Republican Party too. But they adopt a lot of the old Whig positions about like higher tariffs, government promoting, the growth of like railroads and infrastructure and things like that. But one of the most important things about the Republican Party, which is founded in 1854, John C. Fremont's the first presidential candidate in 1856. Lincoln's their first successful presidential candidate in 1860. But their most significant policy position is that they want to stop the expansion of slavery westward. No new slave states, no new slave territories. Abolitionists could support this, but at the same time, you think about this. Even a lot of people who were indifferent morally on, obviously slavery's immoral, period, but a lot of the contemporary people living back then who were indifferent on the morality of slavery, or immorality, I should say, could still get behind stopping the expansion of slavery because they didn't want to compete against rich white Southerners that could move out west to the territories, buy up the best farmland, have hundreds, maybe even thousands of slaves working it, potentially, depending on how rich you are. And even in the North, if you were a free black, you probably couldn't vote in this time period. And think about, let me actually kind of just go through the voting rights here. I believe it's only 4 states allowed black men the right to vote in the antebellum period just before the Civil War, all in the New England area. And then the Civil War kind of happens. Abraham Lincoln, in his final public speech, proposes some limited black voting rights for those who are literate or are in or were in the military. And then in 1870, we get the 15th Amendment passed. And the 15th Amendment says you can't discriminate voting rights based on race. And when Grant is president, he basically does a pretty good job of enforcing that. And you see African Americans voting from 1870 to the 1876 election in pretty good numbers. You see thousands of black people get elected at the local, state, and even national levels. You get a handful of U.S. senators and U.S. House of Representative members that are African Americans from down south, kind of during this time period, and black people can vote. Now, there's still some intimidation. They can't always vote perfectly. There's a lot of voter fraud where their votes are just kind of thrown out, or voter fraud where maybe they're intimidated when they go to vote by the threat of violence from racist terrorist groups like the KKK, and there's some other ones down there too, racist terrorist groups at the time. But for the most part, you see large amounts of African Americans voting nationwide because of that 15th Amendment in 1870, which allows black voting rights. But then after this post-Reconstruction time period, and after 1877, when Reconstruction ends, most black people live in states where they start to steal the voting rights from away from them. And they claim that they're not violating the 15th Amendment by things like, oh, it's the grandfather clause. It's based on if your grandfather could vote and it's nothing to do with race. Well, give me a break. I mean, obviously that's absurd. Or like a poll tax or a literacy test, but we're not going to educate you, but we're going to give you a literacy test, or we might not even administer the literacy test fairly. I might give a white person a very easy literacy test and a black person a more difficult one. So a lot of the southern states, once Reconstruction ends, start finding ways where they can circumvent that 15th Amendment. So only about 4 states allow black men the right to vote in this first antebellum time period, Civil War. Then 1870 under Reconstruction, in theory, all states with the 15th Amendment are allowing it. But then the government kind of stops enforcing it once Hayes becomes president. The Reconstruction kind of becomes politically unpopular. Hayes wins a very controversial election, which he arguably didn't win fairly. Who knows? Historians kind of still debate about that. Both sides were actually committing fraud back then. There's good evidence of that. But then after Reconstruction, most blacks live in states. It's predominantly the southern states that are doing this, where you can't vote. Think about this. In the antebellum time period, which means before the Civil War, there's a lot of states that have counties where they make county. Illinois and Indiana are infamous for this horrific thing, but they'd actually pass like laws that like no black person can move into and reside in the county. And so forth. Southern Indiana and southern Illinois had lots of counties like that. And so there was lots of discrimination in the North, too. One of the biggest misperceptions that kids have is they think that, like, the South is where all the bad things happen and then everything's hunky-dory in the North. In fact, the former slave states in this Reconstruction time period or post-Reconstruction time period, the segregation laws, 80% were in the former slave states. 80% of the segregation laws were in the former slave states, but 20%, that's still 1 of every 5, were in the what would have been the free states or free territories or territories at the time. So kind of keep that in mind, that segregation laws, unfortunately, it's a national sin. It was nationwide at times. For example, 1919, Chicago has race riots, and it starts where people die. Whites and blacks die in this race riot, and it's the summer of 1919 race riots. But it starts because Chicago has segregated beaches. They have a whites-only beach and a blacks-only beach, and like you know how you kind of like go out swimming in Lake Michigan, and you're kind of goofing around with your friends, and the next thing you look up and you're like maybe 100 yards down from where you put your towels because the current just kind of pushed you away. And I've seen different accounts, and I don't know which account's most accurate, but some people think that this young black boy didn't even intend to go on the white beach. The current just naturally drifted him that way, and then these idiots start throwing rocks at him. Well, if you're in the water swimming and stuff, the only part of your head is from like the shoulders. The only part of your body is like your head and shoulders. They're above the water, and so they're throwing rocks at him. And when they hit him, he gets hit in the head, and he goes down under. And by the time he's finally rescued, it's too late. He ends up drowning to death. And a person dies in Lake Michigan simply because they had, unfortunately, the wrong skin color for the beach he was at. And it was a boy. He wasn't even an adult. Think about that, killing a child, a youth, over the color of their skin. So based on segregation laws in Chicago, the segregated beaches. And that set off that kind of race right there. But so you can see, keep in mind, although segregation is going to end up becoming more pronounced in the South, it exists in the North too. It might not be as ingrained in the society, but it certainly exists, and it's certainly there, and people certainly have negative effects from it. In fact, there's 2 types of segregation: de jure segregation, meaning by law, and de facto, meaning it just happens. There's no law, just for whatever reason, socioeconomic, racism, or just maybe who knows what. But for whatever reasons, people, just live in certain areas. In fact, they say some of the most segregated cities in the country today are actually in the north. Milwaukee, Detroit, Chicago, even Muskegon, Michigan is one of the most top 25 most segregated cities in the country. Philadelphia is considered to have large amounts of segregation, and there's no laws to this day. But for whatever reason, there tends to be neighborhoods that are predominantly one race or a different race, still to this day. And there's no laws. It just happens for whatever reason. Some people say socioeconomic. Some people say residual racism. Who knows? I don't know. But and so you can kind of see like the Civil War. So if you were you might be the odds are you were a slave here. Slaves start getting freed during the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation takes effect January 1st, 1863. 1865, the 13th Amendment frees all slaves everywhere in the country. And I mean, technically it says like if you've been convicted or whatever, then, but that's talking about like prisons and things like that and prison work. But keep in mind, once you're free, it doesn't mean you're 100% free. A lot of states and counties and cities start passing laws that you have to have proof of employment, or that the city will, or the town or state will arrest you and force you to do labor for the government. And they're not targeting white people with these laws. They're targeting black people. There's stories where black people say that they're violently attacked by groups of white people for saying that they don't have an owner or don't quote belong to an owner. I have some primary documents we might try to read the last week before the semester, where some people talk about their experiences dealing with that. And so you are free after 1865, but you might possibly still experience severe restrictions on your movement of freedom, because if I can get arrested in my state, if I don't have proof of employment, well, I'm not going to really be able to go anywhere. I'm not going to be able to really change employers. A lot of think about this, most because of the threats of violence, because of this, because of that, and to be honest, because if you're a slave, it's not like you've had a college education or something like that. All that is kind of from your plantation. That's where your family happens to be. That's where your friends happen to be. So a lot of the freed slaves just go back to work for their former master. So the sad fact is most of them end up becoming sharecroppers. And sharecropping, they have to sign these contracts. Remember, most of them are illiterate. You get this thing called the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War, which tries to help acclimate former slaves to freedom, and they at times try to help these former slaves read these contracts to kind of, tell them how they're getting ripped off. But the sharecropping contracts really do rip off these former slaves. The vast majority of what they grow goes to the landowner. They get nickeled and dimed here and there. If they forget to do something, they get nickeled and dimed, where the landowner gets to keep more and more and more and more. And so you got to kind of keep that in mind. Once many of these slaves are freed, they stay in poverty generationally as sharecroppers. That's why some of the people like Thaddeus Stevens, who's considered a radical Republican, that was the term used at the time, radical Republican, Thaddeus Stevens wanted to say, look, these elite planters, these rich plantation owners, they owned the vast majority of the land down south, or much of the land down south, and they're the ones responsible for this Civil War. So we should confiscate the land of these traitors, these rebels, and break it up and give every black man or family unit 40 acres and a little bit of money to build a homestead on it, like build a home on it. And the fact of the matter is that never really happened. It didn't happen. And so and Thaddeus Stevens was pointing out that, look, a lot of these black people, they're going to be exploited if they don't own their own land, because what are they going to do? They're going to have to go back to work on somebody else's land. It's probably going to be the same slave owner that was oppressing them and ripping them off and exploiting them under slavery. It's going to be the same ones. They're going to be able to do the exact same thing under freedom, because these slaves tend to be penniless when they're freed and uneducated when they're freed. And what are they going to do? Where are they going to go? He says they're going to be exploited, and he was right. And Andrew Johnson, who's president at first during Reconstruction, or at least after Lincoln's assassinated, opposes trying to help the freed black people in every way. And he doesn't want to build schools for blacks. He doesn't want to give black people land. He doesn't want to do this. He doesn't want to do that. Grant, though, he's not perfect. He is not perfect. But he's pretty darn good for the time period. He enforces black voting rights. He's sympathetic. He uses the military against the KKK and what some people call the Ku Klux Klan Act or the Forced Act, where he's mobilizes the military to be able to use to kind of be able to go after the KKK. Remember, the KKK, a lot of people see him as kind of like this joke today, like, nobody really likes them. They get laughed at. They're just a bunch of bozos. Back then, the KKK was a real powerful terrorist organization that killed people routinely. And they didn't just kill black people, especially black people who were seeking more rights. They'd also kill white Northerners who had come down to the South. Some white Northerners came down to the South. They were called carpetbaggers. These are white Northerners who looked to start businesses in the South after the Civil War, or looked to, some of them came down to help, like the Freedmen's Bureau, to like kind of help the freed blacks acclimate to society and democracy and so forth. And the KKK would target these people too. But Grant wipes out the KKK. That's why there's like a second KKK and a third KKK. He pretty much does a good job of kind of shutting down the KKK. President Grant does. And he tries to enforce black voting rights for the most part. Eventually, it gets too politically untenable, and people start to tell him you're going to lose votes in the North for the Republican Party if you push too hard on this down South. Scalawags, they're Southerners who favor the North politically, who like, the Union, save the Union, the North was right, Lincoln was right. People like that, white Southerners who favor the North politically, are called scalawags. Copperheads are Northerners who favor the South politically because they're like the poisonous snake, a copperhead. So they're poisonous. But you get like the 13th Amendment, which frees slaves, the 15th Amendment, which I already talked about, the 15th Amendment, the black voting rights. And you get the 14th Amendment in between there, which is like equal protection, like the government's supposed to give you equal protection. The government's not supposed to discriminate you based on your race, religion, color, ethnicity, nation of origin. And like kind of during this post-Reconstruction, you have black codes that kind of go into effect right away at the end of the Civil War. Like a lot of towns and cities and counties and so forth make laws that black people can't travel alone, or can't travel at night, or travel without an employer's permission is what I meant to say, or can't travel at night, or this or that. Then after Reconstruction, you start to see a lot of Jim Crow laws go into effect to enforce segregation, to enforce sharecropping. The Tuskegee Institute is starting by a man, Booker T. Washington, to try to train African Americans in various skills like carpentry and things like that, to try to get, like some nice, solid middle class jobs besides just sharecropping, to give them some training. Tuskegee Institute is actually still around to this very day. And what they're probably most famous for is during World War II, they trained African Americans in various skills, including they helped train the famous Tuskegee Airmen, who were these African-American pilots. There were these fighter pilots who would try to protect the bombers flying over Germany during World War II, and they did exceptionally well during the war. And there's actually been, if I'm not mistaken, there's been 3 movies made about the Tuskegee Airmen. But, so some things change. You're free. You can no longer have your children sold from you. You can no longer be forced to marry young and things like that. But there's still severe economic oppression, especially with sharecropping going on. You can see how you can vote just in a few states. Then you can kind of vote everywhere. And then you can only vote in basically the northern states, all the way up until Martin Luther King Jr. helps pass that 1965 Voting Rights Act. So you can see how some things kind of stay the same, how some things kind of change a little bit over time. But we would have done this assignment where you pretended to be an African American living through this time period, and kind of noticing how some things might change, how some things might stay the same, and just kind of help you understand what people might have been going through who lived through that time period. But all right, I hope you guys are doing well. I don't know if we'll be back next week or not. On Wednesday, we'll wait and see what the governor says. I'm filming this on Friday. What is it, December 4th, I believe? Yeah, December 4th. So we'll see what the governor says on Monday or Tuesdays when she said she will announce it. But hopefully I'll get to see you guys back in person. Maybe we won't. But either way, stay positive, and we'll get through this together, kids. Just look for the positive things in life and be happy. All right, kids, take care. I wish you all the best. Hey, and study and be positive.